Amen. So today's message is called The People Around Jesus. And what we need to do is we need to look at Luke chapter 15, the context of Luke chapter 15, not so much just the parable that we've considered. So Luke 15 actually begins with the religious leaders noticing something that Jesus seems to attract and befriend tax collectors and sinners. That's what it says in verse 1 of chapter 15. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering round to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." So these were the moral outcasts of respectable society. So remember the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, they were that kind of level of society that, they were the respectable members. And so these tax collectors are a particular category of sinfulness because you get tax collectors and sinners. So sinners are all the obvious ones, and then you get tax collectors, and they're like extra bad. Now, it was extra bad in those days because they were Jewish men that had signed up to collect taxes from their own brothers, from their own fellow Jew, to pay Caesar. So they were just considered the ultimate sinners. So tax collectors and sinners. So we read in verse 2 that they mutter to one another about this. Now it's interesting because when you're looking kind of behind the text and you're looking at Luke, who was a doctor who wrote this. Luke was a Gentile doctor who had traveled with Paul and had been around with Jesus, and he wrote this, and the words that he uses, it's interesting. You can imagine these high society religious men in their flowing robes muttering among themselves as they look at what's going on over here. So they mutter, and we can almost imagine them saying, "He welcomes sinners." What kind of person, this kind of person that he welcomes, they never come to our meetings. He must be telling them something that they want to hear. He's not calling them to repentance or to change. He's just tickling their ears with what they want to hear. Surely sinners, wouldn't come to him if he was really preaching the true gospel of the kingdom. So they're very upset about this. So in response to this, Jesus actually tells 3 parables, which we find in Luke chapter 15. And it's by listening carefully to all 3 parables and then especially the last one, which is traditionally called the parable of the prodigal son. It's by listening carefully to this that we see what Jesus is actually doing in the text as Luke records it, is he's challenging his listeners' very fundamental assumptions about God, about sin and salvation. And so here is the apparent leaders of God's people, these Pharisees and teachers of the law, and they have a particular way of understanding God and of understanding sin and of understanding salvation. And what Jesus is doing is almost like subversively through these parables, he's challenging their very worldview. He's saying everything you thought you knew about God and sin and salvation isn't quite like you thought it was. And that's what these parables are designed to do. So he gives them an entirely new way of thinking about God, about themselves and about the world. And so what we'll do this week is we will notice 3 sets of characters in the story of the whole chapter. 3 sets of characters. The first set of characters is the unwilling listeners. That was the Pharisees. The second set of characters is the actual lost things. What can we learn about the things that were actually lost? And the third set of characters is the joyful seekers. So as we look at all 3 parables, we can see those things are common through all 3 parables. So let's look at the first one, the unwilling listeners, verses 1 to 3. So as I just read, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." Then Jesus told them this parable. So he's speaking to these Pharisees and teachers of the law. He tells them this parable. So you've got these 2 groups of people around Jesus, the tax collectors, the sinners, and the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. The religious group is particularly offended that Jesus eats with sinners. Now, What's the big deal about eating with sinners? Well, table fellowship in those days, inviting someone into your home and sitting around the table and enjoying food together was considered a sign of acceptance. So if you went into someone's home, or you brought someone into your home, it was like a way of saying, I accept you. And it was a way of establishing friendship. So there was no friendship and acceptance without actually eating together. It was a very important symbol, cultural symbol, as to acceptance and friendship. So they thought to themselves, well, how can he be so open to these sinners that he actually does table fellowship with them? He actually eats with them. Doesn't he realize that these are bad people? Surely if he was a prophet, he would know that. Surely if he was sent from God, he would realize how bad these people are. And these are the people that are the real problem with the world, by the way, according to the Pharisees and teachers of the law. Their understanding of the world is that if we could just sort out the tax collectors and the sinners, which included the Romans, then the world would be a better place. So what's going on here, Jesus? So obviously by implication, they're the good guys. You know, they're not saying it, but it's the implication, we are the good guys. So instead of directly arguing with them, Jesus doesn't give a direct answer. He actually responds with these three stories, these three parables. And it's important to realize that these parables are not spoken in a vacuum. There's a context that these parables are spoken into. The purpose of all three parables is to challenge the Pharisees' point of view. You've got to keep coming back to that. The purpose of the whole chapter, all three parables, he's doing something very, very intelligent. He's undermining their point of view as he teaches them these parables. So when we get to the final parable, we will realize that actually both groups of people, both the sinners and the religious people, are actually in the parable. And you would have picked that up from last week when we went over the whole parable. The older brothers are the Pharisees and law teachers, and the younger brothers are the sinners and the tax collectors. And that's why the last story, the story of the prodigal son, is actually Jesus' final answer to them. But that one we'll continue to look at as we go. For now, let's notice how he begins to challenge the Pharisees' attitudes and categories of sin and salvation in just the first two parables. So the first parable, he says, Jesus told them this: suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulder and goes home. Then he calls his friends and neighbors together and says, rejoice with me, I've found my lost sheep. I tell you that in the same way there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than 99 righteous people who do not need to repent. Or suppose a woman has 10 silver coins. So just so you understand the value, one silver coin was the equivalent of 1 day's wages. So anything between $200 and $500 a day, depending on what you earn. 1 full day's wage. And so he says, and she loses one. Doesn't she light a lamp, sweep the whole house, and search carefully until she finds it? And when she finds it, she calls her friends and neighbors together and says, rejoice with me, I have found my lost coin. In the same way, I tell you, there is rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. So he tells them the parable of these lost things, and then, of course, there's the third parable of the lost son. So he's going to confront their categories of sin now. Jesus is going to confront the understanding of lostness. So if we equate lostness with categories of sin. So in the parable of the lost sheep, the shepherd goes out to find the sheep. A sheep is by nature quite a stupid animal. It's quite foolish. And when it gets lost, it's completely helpless. It's not like a dog or a cat that can find its way home. It just kind of wanders around and gets further and further away, and it's just stupid. That's the metaphor that we have of don't be a sheep. Don't just follow and not have any insight and wisdom. Don't be like just a sheep. And so even back in that culture, there was an understanding that sheep really needed hands-on shepherding. If you lose one, it's gone. In the second parable, the lost object is a coin, which is even more incapable of finding its way home. It's a dead object. It's just an object, and once it's lost, it just lies there going la da da di da, and it's just gathering dust. The three lost objects, the sheep, the coin, and then the son, all represent people who are spiritually lost and far from God. So there's three kinds of lostness that we are finding here. This is Jesus characterizing the people the Pharisees saw as sinners. You see, they're all lost, but they're lost in quite different ways. The sheep's lostness, the coin's lostness, and the son's lostness, all lost in different ways. And Jesus wants to challenge the Pharisees' ways of understanding lostness. There's more than just one way to be lost. So the Pharisees view sinners as just one way of being lost, and then obviously they're not. So the sheep is lost through its own foolishness. The coin is lost through the thoughtlessness of others. And the son is lost through his own willfulness. The sheep is foolish, leads to being lost. The coin through mismanagement of others. And the son through his own willfulness. Taken together, this is a very nuanced, multi-dimensional view of lostness. It's a complex, multi-dimensional understanding of sin. Sin is not a simple thing. Lostness is not a simple thing. Here's an example. Let's say Mr. Smith has a problem with abusive anger. He often flies off the handle. At work they call him Mr. Volcano. And he's very often verbally abusive and has actually been known to be physically abusive as well. What's the problem? Why? Why is he sinning in this way? Is his problem genetic? Is it a brain chemistry thing? Is there a tumor that's growing somewhere in his brain and causing him to be incredibly angry? Is it just part of his inborn nature? Is it his temperament? He's just Mr. Sour Grapes. Like, what is it? Maybe as in the example of the sheep, it's just part of their nature to be like that. Or is the problem the result of a bad environment? Perhaps the result of poor parenting, bad family life, a traumatic family life. Maybe he was a refugee who came from a war-torn country and experienced tremendous trauma and mismanagement by the people around him. Maybe it's nurture. Maybe he's like the coin and he's been mismanaged by his supervisors. Maybe that's why he's so angry. Or does his problem stem from his incredible pride? Maybe he's an egomaniac. He's very selfish, narcissistic, we'd say these days, and proud. Maybe he really doesn't care about other people, like the younger son, the prodigal son, who really didn't care about his father's honor and said, "Give me my money, I'm out of here. I'm going to go do my own thing." Maybe it's his own sinful willfulness that leads him to become so angry. So what is it? I'm sure the counselors and psychs would love to sit down with Mr. Smith and dig around, but maybe the answer is that in varying degrees, it's all three. Maybe it's not just one. Maybe one is more prominent, but maybe it's all. Nature, nurture, and choice are all at work. Sin, you see, is deeply complex. It is inborn in you. You don't need to teach wonderful, beautiful children how to be disobedient, how to be stubborn, how to throw a tantrum. It just comes naturally. There's no classes for parents how to have a disobedient child. It's just inborn. It seems to come naturally. But it's magnified by sinful treatment. when you are not treated with the proper respect and honor and love that you deserve, when you are neglected, when you are abused, it magnifies that inborn sense of selfishness, sin that's already there. And it's deepened and shaped by our own choices. And so it's multidimensional, it's very complex. You see, Jesus' view of sin is actually radically more comprehensive and more multidimensional than, say, many today. There's many different schools of psychology, and there's many different understandings of human makeup and how we operate. And the sociologists and the religious leaders all around the world, all the different religions, have got a view of sin and what is sin. I think Jesus' view of sin is a lot more complex than some of the reductionist views of pathology that we have today. It's this, or it's that, or it's that. I think what Jesus is saying is, yes, it is, and a whole lot more. You see, this reductionist view of sin, where we just go, it's just this, or it's just this, has implications. If sin is just a matter of nurture, if you're a lost coin and you were mismanaged, if that's all it is, then you don't take personal responsibility and you become a victim. If all it is your choices, and that, well, you got yourself into it, you made the bed, you sleep in it, and you just got to choose how you respond, it doesn't take into consideration the fact that other people's sin impacts us. And that at times we are indeed victims of abuse. And that does affect us. And so there's got to be more. This reductionist view of sin, which normally, depending on who's doing the framing of what sin is framed around their particular understanding of righteousness. And so, for example, the Pharisees have an understanding of righteousness, which is, let's just simplify it, obeying the 10 Commandments. And so if we see others that break the 10 Commandments, then that's sin. That's a safe way of framing sin because we obey the 10 Commandments. And so we create a view of sin that keeps us safe, while it answers the problem of what's wrong with the world, because everyone else is sinning in this kind of way. So the reductionist view of sin is framed around your own particular understanding of righteousness, so that you can be safe, that you can have a sense of safety in your understanding of sin. But that also then influences your vision of what the kingdom of heaven is. What is the kingdom? The Pharisees had a particular view of what the kingdom was going to be. So did the sinners, and so did the tax collectors. And a lot of that is behind the current culture wars that the West finds itself in. And I don't have time to go into that, and that will derail me from the point of this particular sermon. But a lot of the culture wars that we see here is often around a particular view of what the kingdom is and a particular reductionist view of sin. And if Jesus were to come in today's scene, he might challenge everyone's views and say it's that and a whole lot more. It's more than what you can even see or even understand. So Jesus' view of sin is certainly way more comprehensive than the view that the Pharisees that were listening to him held. And what he's wanting to do is gently and wisely crack open their very fundamentalistic, watertight, stuck in the mud views of what sin is, and slowly send the rain to soften and open their minds as to what actually is the bigger thing that's going on here. They were strict law keepers. But if you look in chapter 16, just one page over, and verse 14 to 15, Jesus is teaching about the shrewd manager, and he makes a comment, and Luke makes the comment, the Pharisees who loved money heard all of this and were sneering at Jesus, because Jesus was talking about you can't love money and God, have two masters, you can only serve one or the other. So what we have is, we have the Pharisees by all means, but what it certainly looks like, they're obeying all the laws. They're keeping the 10 Commandments and all the other laws. But they were lovers of money. Beneath their law keeping, they were actually guilty of breaking the first commandment, which is, you shall have no other God besides me. Now, they weren't doing that in an obvious way, obviously. They were using their law keeping as a way to pursue their ultimate goal, which was to get that sense of power and prestige and acceptance in their community that they were really after, and certainly money would serve to give them that, while they were keeping all the other laws, while they were being righteous. They found a way of getting what they really wanted without breaking the more obvious commandments. And if you remember last week, that's what the older brother did. He found a way of getting what he really wanted by being obedient and staying home and keeping all the laws. For example, you don't really break the 9th commandment, which is don't lie, don't tell lies or false testimony, unless you've actually really already broken the first commandment, which is have no other gods before me. Why would you be tempted to lie? To protect yourself, your integrity, to maybe get the acceptance of others. Maybe I so badly want someone else's acceptance that I tell a white lie or I leave something out. Why? Because I really want them to accept me, to approve me, to affirm me. And so in that moment, their approval becomes more important to me than the approval I already have, like the father said to the older brother, and the approval that I already have in Jesus. And so just for a moment, I break the first commandment. I have something else, another God. Someone else's approval is more important to me, and that leads me to lie. That leads me to steal. That leads me to break the more obvious commandments. Now, the Pharisees were great at not breaking all those commandments, but they didn't actually see that it went deeper than that, what was going on. So you don't lie unless you've broken the first commandment. You don't essentially commit any other sins, obvious sins, unless you've broken the first commandment. We will return to this topic as we go through, but for now, let's understand that the nature of our lostness is actually way worse than what we could ever account for. It's, as they say, the rabbit hole goes way deeper than what you realize. And God in His grace doesn't show us the depths of the rabbit hole. But what Jesus is gently doing is He's challenging the Pharisees' view of how deep the rabbit hole actually goes. It goes deeper than merely breaking commandments. It's a condition of the heart. Yet we do not lose heart, because the parable contrasts this lostness with the great joyfulness of the one who seeks and finds. And that's the conclusion to the parables, is the great joy at the one who seeks and finds. And so we don't lose heart at the revelation of the greatness of our lostness. Let's conclude then with the third group, the joyful seekers. In both parables, there's the shepherd who joyfully brings home the sheep. He picks the sheep up and puts him on his shoulders and carries home. And the woman is so excited about finding the coin that she takes a portion of her coin and puts on a meal and invites her friends around and celebrates. Most people think of religion as humanity's search for God. We like to think of ourselves as spiritual seekers, or as honest inquirers at least. There's actually very few percentage-wise people on the planet that are actually genuinely atheists. There's probably a greater percentage of people that would fall into the agnostic, and then the greatest percentage of people would consider themselves religious or spiritual in some way or another. There's very, very, very few people that are actually atheist. And so for the majority of humanity, we consider ourselves spiritual seekers and wanting to know what the truth is. As we look at the religions of the world, and while they give somewhat different directions as to how to go about finding, salvation, etc., they all seem to agree, all the religions seem to agree, that if you sincerely search for God, whatever God is according to that religion, then you will find him. They all kind of have that message of hope, that if you are sincere in your search, you will find him. Millions of people, billions of people around the world believe that by believing and obeying God's law in the Bible, or the particular faith's sacred text, you can find God. If you seek God through the revelation of the law or the Bible or whatever, if you are a seeker and you are genuine, you can find God. The problem then is that anyone who feels that they have searched for and found God will naturally start to disdain those who haven't, who don't seem to be making any effort. They will naturally start to look down their nose and sneer at those sinners. Look what I did. I searched and I found God. You can too, if only you do 1, 2, 3, 4. You can also find God. You're obviously not trying hard enough. You're obviously not committed enough. And so, this is where we find ourselves in general with the problem of religion. Anyone who feels that they have searched and found God will naturally become a bit self-righteous towards others. They will look at sinners and say, I found God. It's changed my life. If only you do this. Whichever version, even the different versions of Christianity sometimes do that. But the biblical gospel turns this whole idea upside down. The shepherd, who obviously Jesus identifies with, must go and seek and save that which is lost. Likewise, the coin cannot find its owner. The owner finds the coin. And here's the first great blow to the world's categories of religion that Jesus is bringing. Every other religion says that we can search for and find God if we try hard enough. Only Christianity, of all the world's religions, says no. God has to come into the world to seek and save that which is lost. Salvation must be by grace, not by your achievement. The end of each parable challenges not just the categories of the Pharisees, but their very heart and their very attitudes. This is a theme there's a theme that runs through all three, and that is the theme of joy at the finding. Whenever the lost has been found, there's this great theme of joy. God does not look down at spiritually lost people the way that Pharisees do. God has a different attitude towards the lost than what the Pharisees and law keepers do in the parable. Because the Pharisees do not see themselves as lost sinners saved by grace, they naturally disdain sinners. They look down on sinners. They feel superior to them. But heaven rejoices when sinners are reached and found. And as we know from other texts, Jesus is the great shepherd. He has even more intent and even more joy than the shepherd in the parable and the woman in the parable. Even more intention and more joy. Jesus knew that he would actually have to give up his life to bring the lost home. But Hebrews 12:2 says, "For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame." The joy that he had in doing his Father's will and the joy that he had in finding us was so great that he was willing to endure the cross. And what we're going to do now is we're going to celebrate the token of what Jesus did for us in his broken body and in the cup as we take communion together, and we simply come with hearts that say, thank you, it's by sheer grace that you have saved us.